Hi, everybody. So glad you are participating tonight in our webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. So for the next few minutes, the next little bit, we're going to talk about activism or slacktivism. Does social media activism inspire legitimate action, or just, as some might say, or some might purport, just lazy, irresponsible, sort of woke wannabe liking? And this is sort of how it's going to roll tonight. So we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction. Next slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about who I am, and we'll jump right into a little bit of an introduction about this presentation. We're then going to talk just a little bit about activism, but I am going to provide some historical context, albeit not comprehensive, so I will put that out there right away. This is legitimately an overview, just a brief, quick overview so that we can put activism in a historical context. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Slacktivism. I'm going to show just a little bit of a video, kind of a fun sketch that SNL did a couple of years ago that sort of showcases and highlights, I think, more of the pejorative nature of how folks utilize that term Slacktivism when it comes to digital activism. And then we're going to close out a little bit. I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to hopefully invite a little bit of conversation via the chat, because I'm really super interested in getting some feedback and getting a little bit of understanding of the participants' views around activism versus slacktivism. So a little bit about me. My name is Angie Wolf. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am Director of Leadership Learning, Service, and Advocacy at the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford, a regional campus of the University of Pittsburgh system. And I like flaws, and I feel more comfortable around people who have them. And I myself am made entirely of flaws stitched together with good intentions. And I'm leading with this simply because I like to use this phrase when I'm working with students or when we're workshopping or doing some trainings, that I am here not to be right, but I'm here to get it right. And so I am continuously learning. I love to learn. I'm a huge fan of narrative and storytelling, and I believe that the truth lies somewhere in that perception and that perspective in narrative. And so I guess I just want you to know a little bit about the fact that I am here. I don't intend to have all of the answers, but my intentions are good, and my intentions are student-centered, the greater good centered, and human-centered. In addition to my role as director in our center here, I work closely with our career services, professional development educator, and we are looking to bring both of our offices together in what we're calling the Center for Purposeful Engagement. So really connecting into immersive, experiential praxis for students and helping them bridge that connection. I also am the mindfulness meditation facilitator and yoga instructor on campus. And I live in Kane, Pennsylvania. If there are folks out there that hail from around the McKean County region, I am from Kane, Pennsylvania. I live there with my husband, my two sons, and this is one of our little dogs. This is Harley, and there's also Sophie at home. So I'm going to move forward. And I like to have a little bit of fun, so I'm hoping you'll join me. What's super exciting for me is that we are in yet again, and I should have put yet again in parentheses, a groundswell moment. And what was exciting to me when I was reviewing this UCLA survey, that undergraduates nationwide, 1 in 10 are expected to partake in protests while in college, and that's the highest rate since 1967. I know when I present to students, I usually lead by saying, what is it that you think that professors and parents and families think about you as a generation? And generally, I get a list of about 10 to 15 different qualities that are extremely negative. we're always on our phones, we're lazy, we don't want to participate, we're not vocal, we don't communicate. And I tend to flip it and say how excited I am that this generation is as interested in activating as they are. And I was grateful to find this survey to really focus in on that point. I do believe that there's a deep affinity between generational change and social change. And in my experience working with students and working with community partners and working in service, in partnership, in collaboration with others, that I am excited because students tend to come of age and find their identities right here on college campuses and right here on our campus in Bradford with 3 tools that are essential, I feel, for renewal. They tend to really have a wonderful critical eye of the world, a clear view of its needs and pain, its suffering, and they are able to see it, they feel it, they experience it, and they lean into the messiness and the disruption that surrounds it. And lastly, I find that they have hopeful hearts that give me a sense of the world's promise and possibilities. And for that, I am super grateful. So I'm excited to do the work that I do. I feel like it's a gift to do the work that I do, in particular with the people and the students and the colleagues that I get to do that with. And I'm not just saying that, that's actually very true for me. So I'm grateful for that. So to start with, I want to be clear. My interest here lies in how students are grappling with what counts as appropriate social action and productive modes of engagement in the digital era. So I really want to know how students are wrestling with finding their activist, their organizing, their community engaged identities, and how they are using those identities and those perceptions in the digital area. And it's really my contention that through these types of talks, norms and values that surround activism and the public good are really wrestled with. They're weighed out, they're dialogued, they're debated, and excitingly for me, they're constantly redefined. So I am a person who really encourages, supports, and hopes to use the power and privilege that I have in the various identities that I walk through and walk with and walk in to lean into disruption and to lean into that disruption with students. So if the current COVID imposed circumstances have provided any opportunity for my personal and professional worlds, it has been to really ramp up the efforts to challenge the dominant perspective. And that has helped me to really focus on providing a space in my work to allow students to explore not only how they view themselves and others as civic and social participants, how they make sense of that activist identity, but also how they act on those perceptions. Again, I'm going to say that I am here to get it right, not to be right. I hope you'll join me in that endeavor as we move through the information in this presentation. I really think that being right one way or another or coming to win, we already have. And so let's get that out of the way so that we can move into the work. Really, we can just kind of lean into that. Have to start by asking, who will we be to each other in this process? Who will we be to each other? And again, like I said, if we came here to be right and we came here to win, we already have, we're going to move on. The dialogue here is probably what's the most important. And your opportunity and your ability to take in the information and filter it through your own experience and see where it fits, where it doesn't fit, what's resonating with you and what isn't resonating. So I'd ask you during the presentation to practice some self-care, to do whatever it is that you need to do to be as fully present to yourself and to be as authentic in this space as you possibly can. I'd ask you maybe to listen to understand, to be open-minded and self-challenging, That's where the learning edge is for me, is in that space where I begin to get a little bit uncomfortable. I'm still feeling safe. It's asking me to risk and to be brave a little bit, and it's pushing up against what is comfortable for me. Always speaking from the I, and I will do my best to do that when I'm presenting. Striving to demonstrate civility, empathy, and kindness. One of the things that I use when I speak with students is let's work on the issue, not on the person. Leaning into that discomfort and embracing the uncomfortable as a pathway for growth. Again, coming to that learning edge. Something that I always try to do and I always tried to lead with is embodying a generosity of spirit, understanding that there might be a range of knowledge and experiences around the issues we discuss, as there is a range of knowledge and experiences for the participants that are here on the presentation, on the Zoom, and those that are live streaming. I'm not aware of your backgrounds and your histories and where you're coming from and your stories. I wish I could be, but I'm not. And I want to honor the fact that I'm not aware of that. And I'm going to bring as much of myself to that space as I possibly can. And lastly, I would say let's expect some unfinished business. I think it is a tendency of mine when I attend a workshop or a training or an informational session to want to walk away with a package that is neatly tied off and wrapped up. And if I've learned anything over my years of working in advocacy and working in leadership learning and working with students and working on college campuses in a variety of progressive ways, is that the messier they are, the more chaotic they tend to be, the more deeper the learning. And so I know that this probably isn't going to be wrapped up and packaged. I'm not the end all about this conversation. So I would hope that this might spark a little bit of interest in the topic for you to take this to a place in your own experience that challenges yourself just a little bit more. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about the word activist. And of course, the word activist means action and involvement, in particular in matters of civic and social concern. It is that active participation in group behavior for the purpose of creating change in attitudes, knowledge, and behavior. Different from organizing, maybe different from volunteering, although those can have parts of it. There are lots of different terms. The activist is really focused on doing some sort of action or involvement that is focused on civic and social concern, and in particular, civic and social change for the better, for the greater good. So I'm going to do my very best to provide a brief history of student activism. And this is really an overview of early US student protests and is not at all comprehensive. It would take us hours to go through it all. So I just wanted to try to bring us into a historical context a little bit before we move on to sort of challenging this notion of slacktivism as it sort of bumps up against the history and the understanding of student activism. And this is again from a student perspective, fully not comprehensive, but we're going to get started. So if we're looking, 1766 was the first recorded American student rebellion, and that occurred at Harvard University because of the poor quality of the butter served in the commons. So in the early 19th century, violence was prevalent in student protest. It ranged from property destruction at Princeton to the death of a professor at the University of Virginia. And by the close of the century, student activism had prompted the establishment of things that we know today as debating clubs, literary societies and magazines, fraternities, elaborate student government systems, and the sanctioning of sporting events. So at the turn of the century, broader issues of both a political and social nature began to arise, and these focused on primarily helping newly arrived immigrants and urban poor, as well as the anti-war sentiments began to emerge. In the 1920s, it brought an increase in student criticism toward higher education. So we started to see early, and I'm going to move on. Sorry, I didn't change the slide. In the 1920s, there was the focus from a higher ed perspective on curriculum or curricula that were irrelevant to social concerns. Students were questioning the role of higher education with a focus on academic freedom. Moving into the 1930s, there was opposition to war, and that continued to build, resulting in those peace strikes in the 1930s. And during this decade, the ramifications of the Depression, the talk of war produced and sustained a period of student activism. And I want to say this, of a scope and intensity previously unknown to American society. So important also is during this decade that we saw the first nationally organized student movement in America. New student organizations were formed, such as the American Student Union, which increased the numbers of students involved in campus unrest. The 1950s, known as the silent generation, this was post-World War II. There were new students on campus, including war veterans, and there was a tendency to be drawn more to conformity and stabilization as opposed to activism. And of course, I'm not going to do every one of these generations justice. The prominent themes for the 1960s, of course, were the civil rights, civil liberties, the peace movement, and student life movements. It is important to recognize the distinctive dynamics in the 1960s, in particular of the African-American student movement, and the overall influence that movement had on student activism during the 60s. Radicalism over civil rights, the Vietnam War, the free speech movement, feminism, while still confronting racism and other forms of discrimination, both in our society and in education. These really helped to expand student rights and were evident in clearer academic procedures and expectations. 1968, by some, was known as the year of the student, but it was also the year that student movements began to unravel. And with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, this set back the civil rights and anti-war movements. As we moved into the 1970s, we began to see that volunteerism increased in popularity. Causes such as helping, ending world hunger, and combating human rights violations certainly became very popular among students. In the 1970s, the first recorded American student rebellion occurred at Harvard Oh, I'm sorry, this is an old slide. Am I wrong? I'm going to go ahead and move forward. By 1970, Americans were deeply divided over the Vietnam War. Anti-war protests were common and intensified as the number of casualties increased and US troops invaded Cambodia. On May 1st, students at Kent State University in Ohio began a protest against the war. And here we saw that protest and the tragedy that befell Kent State University. In the 1980s, there were early complaints that sparked revolt. These were directed toward student services, requirements, and I think I just got a little bit lost in my slides, so I'm going to move forward. Thank you for bearing with me for just a second. In the 1980s, we saw that our American foreign policy continued to draw the ire of student activists. Beginning in the 1990s, campus activism often centered on issues promoting diversity, group identity, and multiculturalism. And of course, as we move even further and further toward present day, we see protests around the Parkland shooting, Sandy Hook, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, Dreamers, Occupy Wall Street, the Deferred Action for Deportation, and the protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I say that regardless of the time period, the tactics employed, the causes fought for, there's one commonality that exists among these student activists, and they are trying to change the world. And that world might be as small as their campus or as large as humanity itself, but each student, each group, each movement is moved in some way to better society. And that moves us into our overview of Slacktivism. So a nostalgia for 1960s activism leads many to assume that, quote unquote, real protest only happens on the streets. Critics assume that classic social movement tactics such as rallies and demonstrations represent the only effective model for collectively pressing for change. Putting ourselves on the line and doing that collectively for decades is viewed as the only way people power works. And engaging online in Slacktivism, which really is the juxtaposition, more pejoratively speaking, of two conflicting actions, right? Identifying as an activist and, well, slacking, right? Slacktivism typically means taking to social media to symbolically support a social movement. As defined by the United Nations, is when people support a cause by performing simple measures, but are not truly engaged or devoted to making a change. Okay. So should protest happen online or in the real world, as some are defining it? This really amounts to a debate over the right way to protest. And I would ask us to perhaps consider, do we really have the right to make that call for others? And I just quickly want to show you this. This is just to have some fun. This is an SNL skit on Slacktivism. Came out about 3 years ago. And just give me a second and we'll.
True connection changes you.
Racism can't trust the government.
Should be barred.
Deep mistrust of government.
We got so many problems in this world.
It seemed like there was no hope things would change. But then one man spoke up.
This song goes out to him. Thank you, Scott. On the TV, what did he see? Blood being spilled, war in the Middle East.
Refugees seek safety across the sea, but hundreds are drowning, yearning to be free.
He couldn't sit by and do nothing. He had to act before it was too late. He shared an article on Facebook, and then everything changed.
Thank you, Scott.
You solved the problem, Scott. You brought the struggle to an end, Scott. By sharing that article with 84 Facebook friends. Thank you, Scott. But then Scott realized that black people's lives matter as much as the lives of the whites.
Some people protested and got arrested. He'd have to do more to end that oppression.
He knew he had to stand up. He knew he had to march over to his laptop and write Black Lives Matter in his Twitter bio. Thank you, Scott. You ended racism, Scott. Now we're all equal, Scott. And compared to you, MLK didn't do at all. Thank you, Scott.
You know why I love this dude the most? He tells me how to feel on top of his posts. Story about government stripping your rights got him pissed. And he cares, so he shares. And above rights, Women's March, Scott be like. Biofuels, Scott be like. And when his sister had a baby, Scott like. Cause that's a big deal. So raise them hands, every race, color, and creed, for the man blowing up your feed.
Thank you, Scott. You're the hero that we waited for, Scott. We won't ever forget, Scott, that you fight for our rights on your phone while you're on the toilet, Scott. You read things on the internet, Scott. Then you post them on the internet, Scott. For all the lives that you changed and the battles you have fought. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
So Pejorative, of course, really sort of taking a look at and knocking that idea that if I'm just sharing or if I'm just liking something, that I'm feeling good about that action because it feels like I am actively engaging, that I'm activating and being able to move into a space where I'm actively participating in social change. And we're going to take a look at that. That's certainly not my view on it. We're going to start to look at it from the perspective of how others view it, obviously, as we've seen through the SNL skit. And also we're going to look at the ways that this is really positive. And then I'm going to kind of come back to our group and see if there aren't some folks that might want to put up in the chat their experience, maybe having posted, maybe having read what their ideas are with regard to this idea of digital activism or slacktivism. So really, Slacktivism was born after the creation of social media. It's really oftentimes synonymous with viral movements since it's low cost, it's low risk, it's non-committal, and it makes engagement easy for the public. Prime example, I think, of Slacktivism that comes to mind for me of my generation is the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge campaign. People joined in because they liked the feeling of being part of something and knew that it was going toward something that was really very important and was hoping to have a very large impact, which in the end, it actually had quite a big impact. All of our timelines were full of people sharing their videos on social media, challenging their friends to do the same, resulted in tons of social media interactions, millions of dollars for ALS research. So, you know, it might have actually exceeded the number of donations, but the movement really caught on like wildfire, and the campaign was still wildly successful, even inspired several other similar movements. And it got people sort of moving in that direction, wanting to connect with the people in their network and see if they couldn't be engaging in something that was probably really activating and really kind of fun, and at the same time felt like it was leaning in toward a good cause. So it also sparks conversation, right? If my friend Reed shares an article on Twitter, for example, which he most recently did, about helping kids in his community who are on reduced lunches, my inclination, which it was to outreach to Sue and see how he got connected and see what I could do to help. So, you know, say what you will, be as pejorative as maybe some folks might be with regard to slacktivism, but even with a very small cost, like sharing a post, I ended up still inviting my friends into a conversation about how to help children in our area who are on reduced lunches. Facebook too also has a temporary profile picture feature, which also has been very popular in bringing awareness, showing solidarity, supporting causes. We saw it in 2015 after the Paris attacks. We see it every year in support of equality, marriage equality, inclusivity. It's a simple way to show support and bring awareness, oftentimes sparks meaningful conversations about why our profile picture has changed, and kind of gets us into a space of dialogue. And when I think about slacktivism in the real world, or digital activism in the real world, not so digital, I think about us wearing ribbons, right? We wear a ribbon on our shirt or for a specific color or for a specific day to support a specific cause. And really, as it relates to the UN definition, it still gets people asking, what's this all about? Why are you wearing this? Why are you supporting it? And it gives the wearer, it gives me, it gives others the opportunity to talk about the cause that I care about. It gives me the opportunity to open up a dialogue with somebody else, and it gives me the opportunity to perhaps educate others and to get educated. So some of the bad, when I think about slacktivism, some of the downfalls, you know, it has its place, but it's certainly not the end all answer to making big change in the world. So while it can be kind of passive to like a Facebook page or to retweet an article to bring awareness or change, and never really actually get engaged. It sort of pacifies that activist in us and can sometimes work to our detriment. So, you know, there was a study at the University of British Columbia that showed that when consumers gave public support, they were no more likely to provide more meaningful support for the cause than if someone was just randomly asked for the larger request. So in other words, the factor in what level a person engages in with a cause is if their actions are private or public. So public actions would be social media posts, while private actions would be things like donating or volunteering. So it may inspire, sort of that passive digital activism may inspire, but it's not necessarily pushing folks into action, which is really what is needed to make that deep-rooted social change, okay? So it can be an opportunity to garner more awareness. It can even create so much awareness that it increases donations, right? It can bring more people in, it can educate folks, it can encourage dialogue, it can be an exchange of information. It is definitely not enough, but there is an argument that it is a start. So one of the things that I would like to talk about a little bit is, you know, what are your thoughts on Slacktivism as we're referring to it, in the pejorative, or digital activism? I'm sure, I know that I have. I'm sure that a lot of us have engaged in this. Do you find that it hurts? Do you find that it helps? Could you maybe speak to some ways that you have participated in digital activism or passive activism? Did you feel good about it? Did you actually get to see some of the end results that were positive or negative? And I might invite us to, if it's okay, I know that there's a tech person that's helping me, to maybe share in the chat and see if there's some folks that might be willing to chime in. I'll give us a minute or so. Oh, I'm not sure if my tech support is here. I'm unable to see the chat, so I don't know if I need to stop share. And maybe I do. Ah. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Oh, I think it can help in most cases. Yeah, thanks. Thanks to those of you that are participating. I think it can help in most cases, especially when someone has a large following base and is intending to educate. I don't think it's enough by itself, though, and I think in some cases, like Blackout Tuesday, it can be harmful. I come from a culture which usually avoids confrontation, so I rarely speak out unless it is really impending and dire. We agree that social media has potential to get the word out, but it does little to build capacity necessary for policy change. Absolutely. It doesn't build the relationships necessary to sustain change. 100%, right? That's the foundational piece for organizing. I think that there's a fine line between letting yourself feel like you've done enough by posting and truly helping a cause. I think it can be a good way to educate people, but doesn't always spark change. Fantastic feedback. I really appreciate that. Excellent. Great conversation and really great analyses. So I'm real appreciative of everyone's that's shared in the chat, and those of you that aren't interested or are incapable of being able to put things into the chat right now, but that are really sort of wrestling with this and looking at it through the lens of your own activist identity. I think that that's important. And I know that really even in putting this presentation together and putting things down, that I've done some self-reflection with regard to that too. I think it's easy to quickly share something without fully learning about an issue or potentially sharing misinformation. 100%. 100%. It's not enough for me. I always want to do more. Maybe it's because my family started to take me to protests at the age of 2, but it's not enough for me. It feels like cheating. Wow. Fantastic. Well, I certainly appreciate it. And if there are those of you that want to continue to post, you're welcome to. I see that there's some coming in. It feels very performative in some cases, especially in Greek life. They just follow trends and it feels forced. Yeah, that's some of the criticism that it gets, right? That pejorative slacktivist kind of pieces, you know, is this really about the cause or is this more about me? You know, I think most recently, we've seen a lot around that. I've seen a lot with regard to, there was an article that I read about a group of celebrities during COVID that posted themselves in different phases singing a John Lennon song, the Imagine, and their inability to see their power and their privilege with regard to all of those that were struggling to achieve healthcare, the underrepresented communities that were, and those that we have marginalized in our society and through our systems that we have not provided them with access and have not provided, that they were not able to see that. And so a lot of times, some folks' intentions coming forward can actually appear to be more about being able to be seen as if I'm doing something, right? So it becomes like a tick off the list, like I've checked that one off the list, or people are going to see me in a certain way. There is no follow-up to their activism. Emails to congressmen, senators, or appointed officials are lacking. I think it's important to ask what you would do if no one was watching. Fantastic, right? That reflective piece of praxis, right? That's really grounded in praxis. If someone is going to share a link to a petition or some kind of donation platform, I would hope that they have signed, donated themselves, but I don't think that that's always the case. I'm sure you're right about that, Evelyn. Yeah. So, you know, if it is about us and we feel better knowing that we have put up a new profile frame or, you know, that we have shared a link or shared an article or have talked about how we're doing the work, that's somehow more about us than it is about the cause. There is a vulnerability, there is an intimacy, I think you're right, to being an activist, to identifying yourself as an activist. It is messy. Internally, it can be messy. There is a piece to that. I remember a student once in a presentation a couple of years ago defined character as following through with what you said you would do long after the moment of the feeling in which you said it has passed. And that has always kind of stuck with me. And I think that is resonating a little bit with what some of your chats are saying. That feeling like if I can just get through this moment and feel okay about it. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all for your shares. So coming back to this, eyeing the end game, as I call it, you know, I think the conclusion for me, and I would invite you to have a different one. I would invite you to bring a conclusion to this on your own. And again, this could be a day-long workshop talking about not just activism and slacktivism, but activism providing a way more in-depth contextualization of the history, being able to do some sort of grounded, maybe even some narrative work around our identities, our social identities, our activist identities. But the conclusion that I've come to, and I'll speak from my space, is that there really is no one path to change. However, for me, it's difficult for me to simply say there's no one path to change and to each his own, when I know that the reality is in a democratic society that the impact of change is ultimately measured by voices and votes. And that we've made it clear that if the goal, the goal might not be to march or might be some kind of viral fame, but it is policy change, and that requires more of everything. It requires more time, it requires more effort, and it requires more showing up. And so something that I've struggled with as I think about this and really have analyzed my own sort of emotional reactions and responses to some of the digital activism or the liking or the sharing, as opposed to what was referred to as sort of the boots on the ground kind of activist, not necessarily the marching, but actually following through and showing up, getting to the root cause, leaning into the disruption and of the actual issue at hand, right? Is that I want to stay encouraging and supportive of those and give folks an opportunity to start where they are. And I'm holding space for that group and holding space for knowing that there are issues on the rise. There are issues that have been on the rise for a very long time that demand more of us. There are voices calling out for more. And I cannot, I struggle to hold my seat on the tightrope of that space, if that makes sense. I don't have that fully articulated, but I'm just kind of bringing that forward. So I have, with this next slide, an area of grace, I'm hoping, question mark, knowing that there are some posting on social media, knowing that there are some that are protesting in the streets, knowing that there are some that are donating silently, not looking for recognition. Some are in a space where they're educating themselves. Some, as one of our chatters indicated, come from a history or a background or a narrative that says we don't speak forward with this. We don't, that's not something that was comfortably introduced maybe in our histories. Some are having or learning to have tough conversations with friends and family. And I recognize that a revolution has many lanes, and I want to recognize and honor the need for kindness to ourselves and others who are traveling in the same direction. But I also need to recognize the need to keep the foot on the gas. Because again, I want to honor the voices that are crying out and asking for more, that need more. The sense of allyship becomes the role of accomplice. One of the things that I guess I think in closing that I wanted to bring us to is the opportunity to have a voice and to be a voice through our opportunity to vote. And I say this in a nonpartisan perspective, but I just want to bring that reminder first and foremost into the forefront that we are in a space right now, in particular where we can do more. We can do more. And in the same time, caring for ourselves, caring for each other, One of the quotes that I have on my computer is from Audre Lorde that says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. In where we are right now, there is a collective weariness, and some communities are experiencing that weariness to an exponential degree right now. And that's, again, part of that not being able to hold seat. So in closing, I want to thank those that participated. This is again, the conversation doesn't end, the conversation continues. I would encourage you all to continue these conversations, to wrestle with this. Appreciate, again, just sitting in gratitude for the bravery of bringing yourself, your authentic self, into the chat to talk about and to stand in the truth of where you are with regard to this very issue, this small issue that has a very huge impact. And thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your energy, and thank you for your spirit. I'm very grateful for that.